I received a request from David DeJordy who wants to know more about working with ellipses in DataCAD. While creating an ellipse is pretty straightforward, editing an ellipse can be a bit trickier. So let's take a look at what some of our options are. You'll find ellipse in the Curves menu. Within the Curves menu, I'll select Ellipse, and DataCAD prompts me for the first corner of the ellipse rectangle. Now DataCAD's prompting me for the second corner of the ellipse rectangle. So you can see that DataCAD is just drawing the ellipse within the extents of this imaginary rectangle. I'll go ahead and select the second corner and complete creating the ellipse. I'll go ahead and create a few more just to illustrate how this works. So now let's take a look at how we might make changes to these ellipses. So before we continue, I'm going to clear these from the screen. Now I'm going to create an ellipse using specific dimensions. So I'll go ahead and pick my first point. And then for the second point, I'll use DataCAD's distance input. I'll type 8 feet for the x distance, and then 4 feet for the y distance. So now I've created an ellipse that fits inside of a rectangle that's 8 feet wide and 4 feet high. So let's go ahead and explore the properties of this ellipse. I'm going to back out of the Ellipse Curves menu, and then double click on the ellipse. Double-clicking on an entity in DataCAD brings up the properties of that entity. So on the right-hand side here, I've got the Ellipse Properties dialog. And toward the bottom of this list, I can see some of the unique values that pertain to this type of entity. On the left-hand side here, I have a three-dimensional preview. And because I created the ellipse while having a Z-base and height setting of 1 inch, the ellipse actually has a height value to it. So I go ahead and zoom in on that. You can see that I've got an ellipse that's 8 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 1 inch thick. Now we're going to talk more about the three-dimensional aspects of this a little bit later. So for now I'm going to close the three-dimensional preview and then concentrate on the properties dialog itself. This first option here, rotation, is currently set to 0 degrees. Well, by default in DataCAD, 0 degrees is to the right, and then 90 degrees is counterclockwise toward the top of the screen, and then 180 would be toward the left of the screen, and then 270 degrees would be toward the bottom of the screen. So if I go ahead and change the rotation value from 0 to say 33 degrees, and then press apply, I can see the effect of that change immediately, and you can see the DataCAD rotates the ellipse counterclockwise 33 degrees. If I were to change that to 90 degrees, you would see that the ellipse is essentially vertical now because it's been rotated 90 degrees. I'm going to go ahead and put that back to 0 degrees to restore its original orientation. Now there's two other properties you can access through this dialog that are specific to an ellipse. And the first is start angle, and the second is end angle. Right now, since we have a closed ellipse or a complete ellipse, it starts at 0 and then goes all the way around to 360. If the start and end angle were the same, you'd essentially have an invalid entity because the arc length would be 0. So to illustrate this, I'll go ahead and change the ending angle from 360 to 180 degrees. So what that should do is cause the ellipse to start on the right hand side of the screen and then travel counterclockwise toward the left-hand side of the screen and end at 180 degrees. So when I hit apply, you can see we kind of have a top half of this ellipse. I'll go ahead and set the ending angle to 270 degrees and apply that. And you can see we're essentially working our way around. If I change the starting angle to 90 degrees, now we should end up with the left half of this ellipse. So this is one way to numerically manipulate the parameters of an ellipse, which may be easier than trying to use DataCAD's partial erase command, which we're going to talk about next. I'm going to go ahead and restore the starting and ending angles to 0 and 360. Okay, so now we're back to our original ellipse, and we're going to go to the Erase menu and explore Partial Erase. So you can press the E key at any time to get to the Erase menu, and within the Erase menu you'll find a Partial option. Now that I've selected that, DataCAD is prompting me to select an entity to modify, and in this case I'll pick the ellipse. And once I've done that, I'm prompted to select the first point of the line segment to remove, and then the second point of the line segment to remove. The last selection is which portion of this ellipse that I want to clip out. So I'll just pick in between the 2 points that I selected and remove this portion of the ellipse. So now I'll back out of the Erase menu, double click on the ellipse, and take a look at its properties. And you can see now that I've erased that segment, the starting angle and ending angle have changed. So this illustrates that doing a partial erase on an ellipse is actually modifying the start angle and end angle of the ellipse. Now you see that the ending angle is greater than 360 degrees, which doesn't seem correct. But because the start angle is at 139 degrees, and the ellipse is working its way counterclockwise from that point, it actually passes through 360 and continues to 464 total degrees. So let's round these values off from 139 and change to 139 and 464 and change to 464. I'll hit apply to make that change. And now let's subtract 360 degrees from 464. That would leave us with 104 degrees. So we're thinking, well, we're starting at 139 and we're coming around and ending at 104 degrees. So I'll go ahead and type 104 and then press the Tab key. And you can see that DataCAD automatically adjusts that value to reflect the starting and ending angle for this ellipse. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And take a look at making further edits to this using partial erase. If I go back to the Erase menu and select Partial and pick the entity to modify, if I pick the first point of the segment to remove, and then the second point, and then again pick in between, DataCAD now removes another portion of this ellipse. So let's take a look at the properties of this. Well, now we've got a starting angle of 139 and an ending angle of 230. So essentially what we've done is broken this ellipse into two pieces. Let's bring up the 3D preview to take a look at that. So you can see that we're just dealing with this left-hand segment. I'll go ahead and close that, and then go back. Now if I want to restore this ellipse to its original complete shape, I do so by erasing the new segment that we created by breaking it in two parts. So I'll go to the Erase menu and then pick this segment. And then now I'll bring up the properties of this ellipse and restore it to 0 to 360. I'll set the start angle to 0 and the ending angle to 360. So now we're back to where we started. So let's take a look at a few more ways that we can make changes to ellipses. Well, let's say we'd like to stretch this ellipse. So I'll zoom out here a little bit and then go to DataCAD Stretch menu, where I'm prompted to select the first point of the distance to stretch. And I'll go ahead and object snap to the right side of the ellipse, and then select the second point of the distance to stretch. So I'll pick somewhere to the right here, and then put an area box around the ellipse. And DataCAD comes back and says 0 entities selected. Well, unfortunately, you can't modify an ellipse by using the stretch command. But essentially what you want to do is enlarge the ellipse. And you can do that by using the Enlarge menu. So let's take a look at how we would handle that. If we go to the Enlarge menu, which is Alt-E for Enlarge, we're prompted for the center of enlargement. Well, because we essentially want to stretch this ellipse to the right, I'm going to set the center of enlargement on the left-hand quadrant of this ellipse. And now let's say we want to enlarge it by 2 times. So I'll go to Enlargement, and I'll set the X enlargement by itself to 2 times. So now we're going to be enlarging our entities to twice their size along the x-axis about this quadrant. So I'll go ahead and pick by entity and select the ellipse. And you can see now that the ellipse is 2 times wider than it was. So that's essentially how you stretch an ellipse, is by using the enlargement command. I'm going to undo that, select and copy, and pick that entity again so we can see the before and after results of enlarging the ellipse, which is essentially stretching it. So let's take a look at a way that you can enlarge an ellipse to a specific known size, as opposed to just using some factor like 2 times or 3 times or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this ellipse and go back to our original ellipse. And then I'm going to add a line into the drawing that just represents some wall or something that we may want to use as a reference. And we don't necessarily know the distance from the quadrant of the ellipse to the perpendicular point on this line. All we know is that we want to enlarge this ellipse so that it starts here and finishes here. Okay. So let's go to the Enlarge menu. And the first thing that we're prompted for is the center of enlargement. Well, this time I'm just going to select Previous Center because I'm still going to be using that left quadrant as my center point. Now this time when we select Enlargement, instead of typing the X enlargement in directly, we're going to calibrate or calculate what that enlargement factor should be. So I'm going to pick Calibrate Distance using the by points method. So the first thing DataCAD is asking us for is the first point of, shall we say, the known distance. So I'm going to object snap to the left quadrant of the ellipse, and then for the second point I'm going to object snap to the right quadrant. Now I've told DataCAD that that's my original distance, and now DataCAD's asking me for the second distance. Well, the second distance is also from the left quadrant, but it finishes at this line. Now I need to utilize perpendicular snapping to be able to pick up this point, so I'm going to interrupt what I'm doing here by hitting Shift X. That brings up the Object Snap menu. I can go ahead and enable perpendicular. When I right click, it brings me back to what I was doing, and I can object snap to the perpendicular for my second point. Now DataCAD's calculated that if I multiply the width of that ellipse by 1.7 times, it'll extend not from here to here, but from here all the way to this line. But now that I've set that enlargement, it's applied that to both X and Y. So I need to remember to select Y enlargement and set that to 1, because I only want to enlarge it along the X-axis. Now I'll right click to back up to the Enlarge menu and select this entity to enlarge. Now you can see that we've essentially stretched it from this quadrant to this line. And that's how you would modify an ellipse so that its extents fit within something that already exists. Now there's some other ways that we may want to modify an ellipse, and it's any condition where partial erase or modifying the starting and ending angles or using the enlarge command would suffice. So that would be essentially cropping an ellipse in some fashion. So let's get rid of these two entities and get back to the original ellipse and take a look at how we might do that. Now we might consider just using DataCAD's Clip Cube. Up here on the viewing toolbar there is a Clip Cube option, and that essentially allows you to put a box around any information in DataCAD that you want to see and mask out anything that falls outside of that box. So I'll go ahead and pick New Cube here and draw a box around the ellipse, leaving a portion of it sticking outside of the left and right side of the Clip Cube. I'll right click once and then turn the Clip Cube on. And you can see the ellipse gets clipped off on either, within that box. Now, if all we had in our drawing was the ellipse and anything that lives inside of this box, that would be fine. But the drawing Clip Cube, for the most part, excludes anything that would be outside of that, so it's probably not practical in this case. So I'm going to turn the Clip Cube back off and then exit from the Drawing Clip Cube menu. Well, I can utilize kind of a trick to turn this ellipse into a symbol and then utilize the symbol clipping feature. This allows me to keep the ellipse as an entity by itself and then still have drawing information around that. So to do that, I'm going to go to the Edit pull down and use the Clipboard Select feature and then pick the ellipse entity. So when I pick the ellipse entity, I now have an opportunity to cut or copy that to the clipboard. And for this example, I'm going to use the cut option. And now I'm going to go back to the Edit menu, and I'm going to use a relatively new feature, Paste as Symbol. When I pick Paste as Symbol, DataCAD comes up with a random name. So if I'm really not concerned about the specific name of the symbol in the drawing, I can just accept that. Or if I want to, I can customize that, and I'll just say ellipse. Well, now I'm being prompted to position the symbol on the drawing, and I'm not seeing that ellipse that I just cut to the clipboard. Well, that's because the default handle or the insertion point for that symbol is 0, 0. So I'm going to turn on by center, and now that's going to center the extents of the clipboard data around my cursor so I can place that ellipse where I need to. So I'll go ahead and set that down, and now I've converted that ellipse to a symbol, and that symbol lives only in this drawing. It's not on the hard drive. Now I'm going to control right click on the edge of the ellipse, which is now contained within a symbol instance. And under symbol tools, I'm going to see the option S-clip. And that stands for symbol clip. It's similar to the drawing clip cube, but it applies on a per instance basis for symbols. So I'll go ahead and pick S-clip, and then I'll pick new cube, and I'll put a box around the right half of the ellipse, and then turn the clip cube on. So now we've got just that portion of the ellipse being shown, and this may be a more convenient way than using partial erase or starting an ending angle to clip out the ellipse in this place. Now another advantage of the symbol clip over the drawing clip cube is that the symbol clip cube can also be a non-rectangular polyline boundary. So let's go back and control right click on this symbol, go to symbol tools and pick S-clip, and select new cube. Well, within this new cube menu we see an option for polyline. So if you want to create a clipping boundary that is non-rectangular, you can select polyline, and then DataCAD's prompting us for the first point of the clipping boundary. So I'll just go ahead and arbitrarily pick a point, and this is just like the polyline menu. So from here I can go ahead and select a number of points in a non-rectangular fashion, and now I've got this clipping boundary, which is pretty complex, and that just demonstrates that you're not limited to a rectangular boundary, and to achieve this using partial erase, while it's possible, would result in half a dozen ellipses and managing them. So this might be a much more practical way to do that. And just as a reminder, this dashed clipping boundary never prints. It's just displayed for convenience. You can actually snap to that boundary, and under program preferences you can display these clipping boundaries or not, but by default they're shown. Now, in the second part of exploring ellipses, I'm going to get into the three-dimensional aspects of using ellipses and working with things like cylinders and tori to create elliptical shaped objects. So hopefully this 2D portion of ellipses been helpful for you. And as always, if you have any comments or questions, please enter them in the space below this video to start a discussion. And thanks for listening.